Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the structures of neurophysiology. The nervous system is divided into two systems, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The first we're going to talk about is the central nervous system. Now, back before the age of science and all of the fancy tools that we have today, people believed that certain areas of the brain controlled certain things, like time and memory or tune or destructiveness of combativeness and friendship and hope and all those things. And it wasn't until the last several 100 years that researchers have started to figure out really more about how the brain works. To understand the nervous system, we need to first understand a bit of its basic anatomy. So, the central nervous system, is divided into gray matter, which you see over here, and white matter, which is kind of like the white areas. The gray matter is going to consist of unmyelinated nerve cell bodies, dendrites, and axon terminals, and they form up to 6 layers, as can be seen here. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, that's the gray matter. Then the white matter is mostly going to be myelinated axons, so those that have myelination around them, and it contains very few cell bodies and only axons. And its pale color obviously comes from the myelin sheaths, but you can think of the white matter as that's the area of the brain where all of the signaling transfer happens from one area of gray matter to another area of gray matter. That's how I usually think of it. The brain also, if we look at the posterior view of the human, you have the cranium, which is pretty much the skull that surrounds the nervous system, central nervous system. And you have two cerebral hemispheres, the left side and the right side, and in the back you have the cerebellum. And we'll talk about that and how they are further divided. Then you have the cervical spinal nerves, which is pretty much the top area around the neck. You have the thoracic spinal nerves, which runs along down the back, and the lumbar spinal nerves that are your low back, and then the sacral spinal nerves, which attach to your hip bones down here. Now, the meninges are highly specialized material that surrounds your brain, so your gray matter, and it sits between the brain and the cranium. The main function of the meninge is really to act as a shock absorber between the brain and the cranium, so that if you bump your head or anything like that, there's a little bit of buffering and shock absorbance that happens. The meninges also carry all of the vasculature that comes to the brain, that supplies the brain of oxygen and removes any of the toxins that are being produced. The meninges consist of the dura mater, which is a really thick outer layer, and it contains sinuses like the venous sinus that allows for the veins and blood to drain into the venous sinus and be taken away. Then you have the arachnoid membrane, which is next, and they're loosely tied inner membranes, and they leave some spacing between them. Okay, and this contains cerebral spinal fluid, and this is the specific area that acts as the shock absorber. And then lastly, you have the pia mater. The pia mater is like a very thin membrane that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord, and the arteries that supply the blood are found in the pia mater. Now, the cerebral spinal fluid is the physical protection as well as the chemical protection for the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain and the spinal cord really floats within the cerebral spinal fluid. And here you can see there are ways that the cerebral spinal fluid can move from my arachnoid venous into my blood venous sinuses and be transported all around the brain. Okay? The cerebrospinal fluid is secreted into the ventricles, and it's going to flow throughout the subarachnoid space where it cushions the central nervous system. And you have specialized cells here in the center of your brain that is called the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus looks like this. And it transports ions and nutrients from the blood into the cerebral spinal fluid and also out of it. So it helps maintain the balance between those things. Now, what is really important around the brain is what is known as the blood-brain barrier. And this is really, you have to think of this barrier as it is very highly selective to what it allows to pass through into the brain. And so the membrane permeability, it is extremely regulated. And the reason it's so regulated is so that it can shelter the brain from toxins, from fluctuating hormones and ions and neurotransmitters that are in the blood that could pose harm to the brain cells. And so that kind of sums up blood-brain barrier. Now, if we move on to the spinal cord, let's just take a look at the anatomy real quick. You have the central canal that is made up of gray matter. You have white matter that surrounds all of the gray matter. So remember, the white matter is all the axons, and the gray matter is where all of the cell bodies live. And then you have specialized spinal nerves that are come from the axons and the white matter. It's kind of like they all collect together to form a spinal nerve coming out. And so that entire thing you call the spinal cord. Around the spinal cord you have your meninges, so you have your pia mater, your arachnoid membrane, and so your dura mater. And so what you need to understand is that the meninges really kind of coats the entire spinal cord and brain. It's like if you had like candle wax and you dipped something into the candle wax, every exposed surface is covered by that candle wax. The same idea applies to the meninges. They cover every single little crevice around the spinal cord and the brain in order to protect it. Taking a slice of the spinal cord and taking a deeper look at some specific areas of it, we have the dorsal root ganglion, and this is going to carry afferent signals to the central nervous system. So remember, afferent nerves carry information from my senses on my body to my central nervous system. Okay? So whether that be touch, temperature, and so forth, all of this is information coming towards my central nervous system. And they all have their cell bodies located in one place, and that's known as the dorsal root ganglion. The ventral root carries efferent information to the motors and glands. So remember, efferent information is information that is sent from the brain to the body. So creating muscle contraction to result in movement or so forth. Okay, or dilating your pupils or any of those sorts of things that need to occur. So the sensory fibers from the dorsal root synapse, they're going to synapse onto what is known as interneurons in the dorsal horn over here. Okay? And when they synapse onto the gray matter, they're going to then forward their information on. The dorsal horn cell bodies are organized into two distinct nuclei, one for somatic information and one for visceral information. Remember that last lecture we covered those distinctions in detail. The ventral horn is organized also into somatic but then autonomic nuclei. The white matter can be divided into tracts or axons that transfer information up and down the spinal cord. Ascending tracts take sensory information to the brain. Descending tracts carry information from the brain to the body. So let's take a look at one example. So the best example to think about is spinal reflexes. So if I sat on the edge of a desk and I hit my patellar tendon, what would happen is that my leg would swing forward. Well, that is called a spinal reflex. And the way that works is like you have a stimulus such as a hit on the tendon. The tendon recognizes that it has changed length. It takes that sensory information and sends it up my dorsal root to my dorsal horn, where it synapses onto an interneuron that then synapses onto an afferent motor neuron that is going to send information back down to my muscle, telling my muscle that it needs to contract, and thus my leg is going to swing. At the same time, though, there's a signal that goes to the axon, and that axon is going to send information up to this via the ascending pathway to my brain to let me know, oh, my leg swung, and it swung because of the stimulus. Now, the brain can be divided into a few different regions. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, temporal lobe, cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata. Now, the skull pretty much sits right over your brain, and so it's easy to remember the names of the bone because they match the name of the brain part. So frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, and temporal bone. Let's take a look at what each of these areas do. So first of all, your frontal lobe is really responsible for coordinating all of the information from all of the associated areas, and it's going to control behavior. So if you have to do any planning, or if you have to do any movement or anything like that, your frontal lobe is going to come into play. Your frontal lobe consists of, has an area that is highly specialized that deals with skeletal muscle movement, and it is called the primary motor cortex and the motor association area. The parietal lobe, on the other hand, is responsible for analyzing all of the sensory information that comes in from your vision, from your hearing, from your muscle, skeletal, all of those things, okay, your taste buds, your viscera. The parietal lobe has an area called the somatic sensory cortex that takes all of that information and analyzes it and makes decisions. And it's really cool because the sensory cortex lies right next to the motor cortex, which one would anticipate, right? Because it's the shortest pathway between sensing something to creating emotion. So the hierarchical organization of the brain is very efficient in that way. The occipital lobe, we believe, is mostly responsible for vision. So it has your visual cortex and your visual association area. And it's actually one of the largest parts of your brain that is dedicated to a single task. And that task is interpreting what your eyes are seeing. If you think about it, you have thousands of different types of stimuli that are hitting your eye that you then need to interpret and understand and see colors and shapes and all of those things. So your occipital lobe is where all of that happens. Next is your temporal lobe, and temporal lobe is where hearing occurs. And it has a specific area called the auditory cortex or the auditory association area. And that's where all the hearing processing takes place. If we pull the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, and the temporal lobe apart, we can look in here a little bit. You can see that there's the gustatory cortex, which is responsible for taste, and the olfactory cortex, which is responsible for smell. If I now slice my brain straight down the middle and I look at one lobe, but I'm looking from the inside, this is what I would see. I would see my frontal lobe wrap around like this, my parietal lobe, my occipital lobe, the cerebellum, the cingulate gyrus, the corpus callosum, your pons, medulla oblongata. And so we're going to spend a few minutes looking at what each of these inner regions and zones do. So the function of the cerebrum, okay, that is the cerebral cortex, and that is pretty much the entire outer area. It is responsible for sensory areas such as perception, motor areas, so your skeletal muscle movements, that's your frontal lobe, association areas, the integration of information, and direction, and so forth, okay? Your basal ganglia, alright, which is not shown here, is also responsible for movement, and the limbic system, which is also not shown, consists of the amygdala and the hippocampus, and the amygdala is responsible for coordinating your emotions and memory, and the hippocampus is for learning and memory. And the functions of the cerebellum, which is down here, is movement coordination. If I take a look at the diencephalon, this is what the diencephalon consists of. It has the thalamus, the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. And we're just going to run through the functions of each of these. The thalamus is your integration center. And so it relays the information from your sensory and your motor information back and forth to each other. Your pineal gland secretes melatonin that lets you sleep. Your hypothalamus is responsible for coordinating and managing homeostasis and behavioral drives. And then your pituitary gland is responsible for hormone secretion. So it's not that your pituitary gland secretes hormones, it's that your pituitary gland controls which hormones are released and how many of them are released and all of those specifications. Now if we start moving a little bit lower, over here, you have what is known as the brainstem. And the brainstem consists of thalamus, the pons, the medulla oblongata. Your midbrain, which is this green area over here, is involved with eye movement. The pons is involved with relay station between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and it coordinates breathing. Your medulla oblongata, down here, is responsible for all of your involuntary functions, such as breathing, such as digestion. Okay, those are all involuntary functions that happen on a real-time basis. And then you have your reticular formation, which is not shown, which takes care of arousal, sleep, muscle tone, and pain modulation. So let's take a little bit of a look at how the brain is wired. And so here I have a diagram. You have your left hand and your right hand, and left eye and right eye. And I have two lobes. I have my right hemisphere and my left hemisphere. And there is a specific set of neurons that connect the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. And that area is called the corpus callosum. Now, as a child, you probably learned that, oh, well, the right side of my brain controls my left side of my body, while the left side of my brain controls the right side of my body. And that is partially true, but only for dominant actions. There is actually always signaling that goes to both. It's just that the non-dominant side is not as highly organized. And you can see here the right side of your right hemisphere is involved with the left visual field. The left hemisphere is involved with the right visual field. Okay, so this is an example of how there's overlap between the two sensors that comes in. Now, language processing occurs in two specific areas in the brain called the Broca's area and the Wernicke area. And language input from the visual cortex, such as reading, or auditory cortex is listening. Okay, so those two, Broca and Wernicke, are going to be taking information both from what you're seeing that you're reading, as well as to what you're listening and what you're hearing at that point in time. So the sensory information is first going to go to the Wernicke area, and then it will go to the Broca's area. After processing output from the Broca's area, the motor cortex gets involved, especially if speech needs to occur or if notes need to be taken, so if writing has to occur. And the best way to understand what the Wernicke and Broca area does is really to understand, to look at the pathology. So if there's damage to the Wernicke's area, okay, this is going to result in the person being unable to understand anything that's spoken to them or anything that they're reading. And so all of the information coming into the body will be nonsensical. They may see the word tree, and the brain the Wernicke's area might register it as banana. Okay, so it doesn't contextually make sense to them. If you have damage in the Broca's area, it means that the Wernicke is fine, so everything that comes in makes sense, but somebody that has the Broca's area that is damaged means that anything that they're speaking or writing is nonsensical, because the Broca's area is responsible for interpreting the information coming in and deciding what needs to be done with it, and deciding, what words need to be spoken or what words need to be written down. And so if your Broca's area is damaged, you might be having a conversation with a patient like that, and they might be like, if they're wanting to say the sky is blue, they may say rat, green, elephant. Completely different words that make absolutely no sense to you as the listener, but to them make complete sense. And for patients like that, a lot of times there can be a lot of frustration involved because their brain just isn't able to choose the words needed to express what it is that they're trying to say. So here you can see a PET scan of a brain at work. So if you're just hearing words, obviously you're just going to be activating the Wernicke's area, which is over here. And also probably your auditory area is also going to be involved, because you're going to have to hear it, and then that signal is going to go to the Wernicke. Seeing words or reading words, that's going to involve your occipital lobe, so you got to see it, and then you got to interpret it, and then it's going to go to the Wernicke's area. Speaking words is going to be all of this in the Broca's area, as well as your motor cortex, because your motor cortex is actually going to control your breathing, how your lips are moving, and how the words are being produced. That's why the motor cortex is really lit up in this PET scan. Now, from your brain, there are what we call cranial nerves. And cranial nerves pretty much control all of the main muscles and senses in your head. And here's how they are labeled by location, and you need to be able to know and understand where all of these are and what all of they are. But a way to remember all of the cranial nerves is to use this mnemonic. Old OP occasionally tries trigonometry and feels very gloomy, vague, and hypoactive. So, cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory cranial nerve. It's a sensor type, and it's involved with smell. Optic is optic cranial nerve, so that's going to be for vision. Ocular motor, those are all the neurons that go to your eye that control like where the eye is looking, the lens shape, so if you're focusing something far or something close, pupil constriction, all of those are controlled from the ocular motor, that is the cranial nerve that runs from the brain to those muscles. The trochlear nerve is also involved with eye movement. The trigeminal nerve is involved with sensory information from your face and your mouth and your motor signals and your chewing and all of that. And it's a mixture of sensory and motor nerves. Abducens is involved with eye movement, and it's for a specific muscle. Facial nerves, this is involved with sensory taste, efferent signals for if you're crying, for tear, for cellular glands, all of those facial expressions, all of those are controlled via your facial nerve. Vestibular cochlear, that's involved with hearing and equilibrium. Glossopharyngeal, those in your neck you have baroreceptors, which is pressure sensors, and chemoreceptors, which are chemical receptors that sit in your blood vessels, right in your neck area. And they're going to be sensing your blood pressure, and they're going to be sensing like what is the composition of your blood. And that information is going to be sent via the glossopharyngeal nerve to your brain so that your brain can regulate any hormones that need to be secreted in order, for example, to vasodilate your arteries if they're being constricted. The vagus cranial nerve is involved with all of your internal organs, your muscles and glands, and its combination. Accessory nerve, muscles for oral activity and muscles in the neck and shoulder. And lastly is the hypoglossal, which is your tongue muscle and literally controls the movement and swallowing of your tongue. So let's carry on with our discussion about an overview for the senses. So our senses can be divided into special senses and somatic senses. Special senses include vision, hearing, taste, smell, and equilibrium. Somatic senses is touch, temperature, pain, itch, and proprioception. Somatic senses can further be divided into somatic stimuli and visceral stimuli. Somatic stimuli is muscle length and tension, or proprioception. And proprioception is just a fancy word to say where in the senses that determine where in space your limbs or your body is located. Visceral stimuli includes blood pressure, gastrointestinal tract, digestion, blood glucose, internal body temperature, osmolarity, lung inflation, pH of the cerebrospinal fluid, pH and oxygen content of your blood. Your body actually has sensors all over the place that detect all of those things and tell your brain what they are. Now, there are 3 types of receptors that we like to look at. First is a single receptor. Now, a single receptor has a lot of free nerve endings, meaning they have a lot of little dendrites at the end. And those dendrites are just plain and open. They may or may not have myelination, depending on how far the signal needs to travel. But they're single receptors in the sense that they can respond to single stimuli. Then you have the complex neural receptor. And this is a dendrite at the end that has a special encasing that's enclosed. And so that it has a layer of connective tissue that surrounds it. And for example, one of these might be the Pacinian corpuscle in your skin that is responsible for sensing pressure, as how hard am I pressing on something. And last is your most specialized sense receptors, and they are cells that release neurotransmitter on two sensory neurons, initiating an action potential. So for example, you have a cell here, it changes polarity and action potentials, it releases a neurotransmitter and it synapses onto a dendrite. And an example is the hair cell found within the ear. If wind blows over these cells, they're going to bend mechanically, and then that bending causes a change in action potential, and thus the signal travels on. So the types of receptors that we have are within the body are chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, photoreceptors, and thermoreceptors. Chemoreceptors, like I told you earlier, are going to detect chemical things. So oxygen, pH, organic molecules, glucose, and so on. So your chemoreceptors are responsible for monitoring the levels of all of those stimuli within the blood and within the body. Mechanoreceptors are the ones that are, they're measuring mechanical things. So pressure, cell stretch, vibration, acceleration of the body. If you're riding through on a car versus on the plane, it's going to have a different level of effect on your body, and that's going to be sensed by your mechanoreceptors. Or if you're riding a roller coaster versus a boat, right? There's different perceptions of each of those, and that's because the mechanoreceptors interpret that differently. Then you have photoreceptors, and photoreceptors are mostly responsible for sensing light, and thermoreceptors, they regulate the heat in your body, so making sure that the core temperature of your body is maintained. Now, in order for sensory transduction to occur, stimulus energy like heat or pressure needs to be converted into information that can be processed by the central nervous system. And so there's ion channels and second messengers through your membrane potentials that change and causes those signals to occur. You need adequate stimulus. So, for example, it might be the difference between putting my finger on one nail versus my entire body lying on a bed of nails, right? Different stimulus is going to affect different things. Or, for example, if I put my finger in a glass of lukewarm water, I'm probably not going to respond as highly. But if I put my same finger into a cup of boiling water, my response is going to probably be that I'm going to yank my hand back. So I need adequate stimulation for that receptor to fire and tell my brain that there is danger and I need to avoid it. And so that falls into reaching that minimum stimulus required in order for that activation to occur. And so let's take a look at how sensitive is the body. And to examine that, we're going to look a little bit more at the skin. Now the skin is interesting because depending on the skin is the largest organ in your body, and depending on where you're measuring, you might have different levels of response, okay? And your receptive fields can change. So, if I have my skin surface, and I then go and I take a compass, and I put the compass on my skin. If, in this case, right, the two compass points fall within a single receptive field, what happens is that those two both get summed in my primary sensory neurons. The primary sensory neuron sends the information from each touch down to the secondary sensory neuron where everything converges, and then the two stimuli that fall within the same receptive field is going to feel like one touch. You're not going to be able to distinguish between those 2 points because there's only a single neuron that runs up. Now, if I have that same compass and I touch on a different part of my body, such as the palm of my hand or the palm of my feet, I have very, very small receptive fields there. And so if I put 2 compass points down, they're each going to synapse, each primary neuron is going to synapse onto its own secondary neuron, and that then is going to result in my central nervous system recognizing that there's 2 distinct points. Okay, so the whole concept here is, depending on the size of your receptive field, is gonna then result in how accurate your information and interpretation is of the information that is being sent to your central nervous system. So sensory pathways in the brain. So we've talked about, some of the neurons and how they run, but just how do we put all of this together? So first of all, you've got your nose, right? Your nose is going to be there to smell scents. And it has going to have olfactory bulb neurons here, and the information is going to be sent from your nose, projected through the olfactory bulb to the olfactory cortex over here. Your eye is going to have most sensory information is going to be transferred from your eye to the thalamus, and the thalamus modifies and relays information to the visual cortex area. Then the equilibrium pathways from your ear is going to come into the thalamus, and is going to go to your somatic sensory area. Sound from the ear is going to go into the thalamus, and then it's going to go to the auditory cortex. Information coming from your tongue is going to go straight to the brainstem and then to the cerebellum. Somatic senses, so touch and that from your skin and from your muscles, is going to come into the thalamus, and then it's going to head into your sensory cortex. And then it's going to be processed and go, it's going to cascade down to whatever needs to occur next. So that concludes my discussion on central nervous system, how the brain is wired, and the efferent and afferent signals. What we're going to look at next is the autonomic nervous system, and then next time we will actually take a closer look at how each of these sensory organs work, and therefore how do they take the stimuli and convert that to meaningful messages that are sent via the axons to the brain. But before we get to next time, we first need to spend a little bit of time talking about the autonomic nervous system. As I've mentioned, we have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic motor neurons, they're going to control skeletal muscle, and they're going to be mostly voluntary. So these are all signals that are coming from my central nervous system, and they're running to my organ. Somatic nervous system, it's going to run to my skeletal muscle, and as you can note, it's just a single neuron. The autonomic nervous system runs from my central nervous system, but then it runs to cardiac muscle, glands, and a lot of other things, okay? And so we're going to spend time now talking about all of those other things. The autonomic neurons are mostly involuntary, so this is not something that you can voluntarily control. And they are part of your fight or flight, which we'll talk about in a minute. And yeah, so let's talk about the difference for autonomic division. There is two states. One state is parasympathetic, and one state is sympathetic. So parasympathetic is kind of like when you're at your most relaxed. So when you're sleeping, when there's not a stimulus around you, you're just kind of like resting and digesting. So maybe you're just sitting on the couch in the evening watching TV after you ate supper. That's kind of when you're in your parasympathetic state. Now, the sympathetic state is what is known as your fight or flight. And this is when, for example, you see a spider in the room and then suddenly you run, you grab a shoe and you hit it. Okay, that would be a fight response. Or if we have the hurricanes coming in the season, so if you see, really strong winds blowing your way, you might take shelter. So you might flight or run away versus facing and fighting it. Because let's face it, nobody can really fight a hurricane. You just kind of have to. So your only option is really to flight or bunker down. Now, so those are your two states. And depending on which state you are, the body has to put its emphasis and its priorities in different areas. And we're going to take a look at that in a second. So what is the, autonomic control centers? What does it involve? Well, your hypothalamus is going to control your temperature control, your water balance, and your eating behavior. The pons is going to control your urinary bladder, your secondary respiratory center, blood pressure control, and then your medulla is where the respiratory center is located. Okay, so let's take a close look at sympathetic on the left, which is the fight or flight, and parasympathetic when you're resting and digesting. I think the easiest usually is for me is to think of the parasympathetic first. And as you can see on this diagram, I kind of have the spinal cord and all the central nervous system and how everything divides up. But over here you can see, okay, so when you're resting and digesting, what are you doing? Your pupils are constricting, your heart rate is going to slow down because it doesn't need to work as hard. Your airways are going to be more constricted because you don't need a lot of air to just digest. There's going to be increased bile secretion so that the stomach acids can eat away at the food that you've digested. There's going to be increased motility and secretion of your digestive system so that the food can move through the intestines. And there's going to be release of enzymes and insulin to help break down the carbohydrates and the calories that you've just taken in. You're going to have release of urine. So maybe if you drink a cup of coffee now, 30 minutes later you have to go to the bathroom, and that's because you're in a relaxed state, and so you're going to want to release urine. And then you're going to be have secretion. All right. Now, in your sympathetic state, so this is your fight or flight. So what is needed for fight or flight, right? Your body is going to need to have be not focused on digesting food. It's going to be focused on saving your butt. That means your heart rate is going to increase. your lungs are gonna work much more efficiently to provide air to your body. Your muscles and enzymes are gonna mucus and enzymes are gonna be secreted. Your pupils are gonna dilate so that you can see better. You're gonna inhibit digestion. You're not gonna have any digestion that's gonna be occurring. And your muscles, no, the muscles aren't part of this, so your body is gonna be in a state of readiness whether you choose to fight or flight. Looking at how the neurons are set up, for parasympathetic, so that's rest and digest, the central nervous system comes down, it synapses on an interneuron or a secondary neuron, and it releases acetylcholine. There's a nicotinic receptor on the other, in the autonomic ganglion cell body, and it releases acetylcholine to the receptor at the end. So this pathway here, when acetylcholine is released on both ends, and for your target tissue, when it receives acetylcholine, it's like, okay, I can now go into rest and digest mode. On the other hand, your sympathetic pathways, the end neurotransmitter that it releases is norepinephrine. And norepinephrine is like, like EpiPens, or when it gives you a big jolt of heart rate increasing, blood supply increasing, and so forth. And norepinephrine is going to synapse onto your target tissues, and it's going to tell your tissues, hey, we got to get ready, we got to fight, we got to fly. And so you can see this can act as, you can think of it as a binary switch, like you're either in parasympathetic or you're in sympathetic stage, but sometimes you're in between, right? So that's why I kind of had that little seesaw in the beginning, because depending on if you're tending towards parasympathetic or tending towards sympathetic, the amount of neurotransmitter released by each of these are going to vary. So you got to think of it in terms of a scale as opposed to just an on-off switch. So if I take a look at my autonomic pathways for the parasympathetic, I have central nervous system. It comes down. I have my acetylcholine in my ganglion, and I have the receptor with acetylcholine at the end, right? So this is going to target smooth and cardiac muscles, endocrine glands, and all of that. Sympathetic pathway, you're going to have acetylcholine up here, and the norepinephrine down here. I already said that. So the last one here is the adrenal sympathetic system. And so this is where it synapses onto your adrenal glands. And your adrenal glands are going to release adrenaline into your bloodstream. And your adrenaline is also going to sync up with those end target muscles like your heart and your, right? So it has to beat faster. And if it has to beat faster, it means it needs extra energy. This right here is another way to divide somatic and autonomic neurons. And somatic, you usually have one efferent path. Autonomic has two, right? Why two? Because you have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Somatic neurons are going to use acetylcholine or nicotinic neurotransmitters, while the autonomic uses acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Somatic motor is usually target tissue or skeletal muscle. With autonomic, it's like all the others that we mentioned already. Somatic, you have axon terminals are going to release neurotransmitters, but the autonomic, you have branches as well as the axon terminals that releases it. And alright, I've talked about the rest. Now, so that takes care of my autonomic nervous system. So next I need to look at my somatic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system is mostly involved with skeletal muscle. So you can think of that as any muscle that results in your body moving. And the place where the neurons that are coming from the brain attaches to the muscle is called the neuromuscular junction. Neuro for neurons, muscular for muscle, junction. So it should be easy to remember. And they form highly specialized interactions, which we'll look in detail when we get to muscles, but for now, all you need to know is that these neurons synapse onto the muscles that cause movement to occur. The motor end plate is this part here, and it is the area of the motor, the muscle here where all the neurons are connected to. The motor end plate is a region, okay, of the muscle membrane that contains high concentrations of acetylcholine. And so the synapsing between the motor neuron and the muscle work very similar to neurons. So you have your synaptic vessel, you have it filled with acetylcholine. It's going to synapse to the axon terminal or the presynaptic terminal. It's going to release the neurotransmitter. It's going to cross and it's going to bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors here. That is part of the muscle. And then this is just the summary, right? So you have acetylcholine in the synaptic vessel. You have calcium that floods in. Calcium causes the synaptic vessel to merge with the plasma membrane. It releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic receptor, and that then causes action potential to occur through the skeletal muscle that causes contraction to occur. Now, I have on T-Square, I've uploaded for you a reading that is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It's a highly interesting case study that I would recommend you reading. And yeah, and we might discuss it in class later. Hope you guys have a great day. Bye-bye.